Today I'm going to show you the family tree of Alexander the Great, as well as his successors who are known as the Dyadic II. I'll be using my brand new Ancient History Family Trees chart, which just launched on Kickstarter today. If you want to get a copy of the poster, you'll want to check out the description for the details. On this chart, the Greek and Macedonian dynasties are shown in light blue. So if we zoom into this section here, you'll see some of the kings of Sparta, as well as some of the important political figures from the Republic of Athens. Alexander the Great comes just after this golden age of Greek history, and he is generally credited with having initiated the Hellenistic period, in which Greek culture started to spread far beyond the borders of Greece. So to understand how Alexander ended up as leader of the Greek world, we have to start with his father, Philip II, king of Macedonia from 359 to 336. It was Philip, not Alexander, who established Macedonia as the main power in and around Greece. At the time, the Persian Empire was still the main enemy of the various Greek states. Philip, using both force and diplomacy, managed to unite almost all of the Greeks in preparation for a major conflict with Persia. But Philip was assassinated before the confrontation with Persia took place. His son Alexander succeeded him and famously defeated the mighty Persian Empire in 330 BCE. He then went on to stretch his empire all the way to the borders of India. But this video is primarily about his family tree, so let's look at that in a bit more detail. Alexander and his father Philip were members of the Argead dynasty. The Argead dynasty was named after the city of Argos, which figures prominently in many Greek legends. Now, this is probably a good time to point out one of the main features of this new chart. Because this poster deals with ancient history, I felt it was important to make a clear distinction between the sections that are considered historical and the sections that are considered legendary. So anything shown in this chart in a bright color is historical, which means that there are a lot of documents and archaeological evidence that can be used to show that these people really did exist and that they did in fact do the things that they are said to have done. As I mentioned earlier, light blue indicates Greeks and Macedonians. Nearby, you can see some Egyptian pharaohs shown in green. Persians are shown in orange. Over here, you'll find India and China. And if we go back, you'll see the Assyrians up here in pink. And down here, you'll see some Romans in purple. But throughout the chart, you'll also notice some gray lines that, if you follow them, lead to sections that are kind of shaded out. This means that you're looking at a section that is either legendary or based primarily on religious tradition rather than on secular sources. So this section up here is basically a family tree of the Trojan War, which is famously described in Homer's Iliad. I'll do a separate video on that topic down the road, but for now, just take note that this section is considered legend, not history. Now, this doesn't mean that these individuals are entirely fictional. Another word that is sometimes used instead of legendary is semi-historical. This means that there may actually have been a real king named Agamemnon, and even a real hero named Heracles or Hercules. However, they were not the descendants of the gods like the stories say they were, nor did they likely do all the amazing things that the stories say they did. So that's why they are shown shaded out. Now, the reason I bring this up is that the dynasty of Alexander the Great, the Argead dynasty, was said to have been descended from the line of Heracles here. And Alexander's mother was said to have descended from the line of Achilles here. So Alexander was not really a foreign king to the Greeks. He had strong roots that supposedly tied back to the ancient Greek legends. Okay, so let's go back to history. You can see here Alexander's mother. Her name was Olympias, and she was a princess from a small kingdom called Epirus. I'll also point out that after conquering Persia, Alexander married 2 Persian princesses. However, he did not have any children with either of them. Had he had a son with a Persian princess, history may have gone in a different direction. But Alexander did have a 3rd wife named Roxana, and through her he had a son who became Alexander the IV. Now, although he accomplished a lot and is one of the most famous individuals in all of ancient history, Alexander the Great actually had a very short life. He became king when he was just 20 years old, and he died when he was just 32. And his death is quite controversial. We know he died in Babylon and that he was sick for almost 2 weeks before he died. One possibility is that he was poisoned. If that was the case, the assassin was never discovered. However, it is also possible that he died from natural causes, such as a typhoid infection. It's one of those historical mysteries that will likely never be solved. And one of the reasons for that is that his body is currently missing. For a long time, the body was kept in Egypt in the city of Alexandria. For example, we know that the Roman Emperor Augustus visited his tomb there. However, sometime after that, the body was either moved or the exact location was forgotten. Up until today, there have been many attempts to locate the tomb and perhaps even the body, but none have been successful. So when Alexander died, things became chaotic. I mentioned his son Alexander the IV earlier, but what I didn't mention was that his son actually was still in his mother's womb when his father died. So some of Alexander's generals wanted to wait for the birth before appointing a successor. However, others wanted to make Alexander's half-brother, who may have been disabled, the new king. In the end, the son and the half-brother were appointed co-monarchs. But keep in mind that Alexander IV was just a small child, and Philip III was mostly just a figurehead. The real power after Alexander the Great's death rested with his generals, who became known as the Dyadici, meaning successors. One of the earlier conflicts in the Wars of the Dyadici was between Alexander the Great's mother, Olympias, and a general named Cassander, who was serving as regent. Olympias was initially victorious and had Philip III killed in order to set the stage for her grandson Alexander IV to become the sole ruler. But eventually Cassander won out, and Olympias and Alexander IV were killed as well. This left Cassander in charge of Macedon, and in 305 he declared himself king. Now, the exact situation is a bit more complicated, but basically around this time, Alexander's empire was divided into 4 parts. Cassander ended up with the original homeland, Greece and Macedonia. Lysimachus, another general, ended up with a good chunk of Asia Minor. But the 2 most important parts went to these 2 generals here. Ptolemy ended up with Egypt, and Seleucus ended up with Syria, Babylon, and Persia. These two dynasties, the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucid dynasty, became the two main powers during the Hellenistic period. And I should point out that Ptolemy I may have been the illegitimate son of Philip II. His line eventually leads to the famous female pharaoh Cleopatra. Now, a lot of people think of Cleopatra as being an Egyptian. However, although she was pharaoh of Egypt, she was actually Greek, or rather Macedonian in terms of her ethnicity. I'll be making a separate video down the road about the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Now, let's go back to the kingdoms of Cassander and Lysimachus. The kingdom of Lysimachus quickly fizzled out, and therefore a Lysimachid dynasty never really took root. Cassander's dynasty, which was named after his father Antipater, didn't last long either. When Cassander died, he was followed by his son Philip IV, but then Philip IV died of natural causes and was replaced by his two younger brothers, Antipater II and Alexander V. They fought over who should be the sole king, which eventually led Demetrius I to come over and settle things by taking the throne for himself. Demetrius was the son of Antigonus I, another one of the Dyadic II. The throne of Macedon then bounced around for a bit, with Lysimachus taking over for a while, then some younger sons of Ptolemy I, then back to a grandson of Antigonus, and from there it pretty much stayed with this new dynasty, the Antigonid dynasty, until Greece fell to the Romans in 168. I'll mention one other person though. Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, also held the title of king of Macedon for a few short years. Pyrrhus, who was a relative of Alexander the Great through his mother's side, is also known as being an early enemy of Rome. His name lives on in the term Pyrrhic Victory, which today refers to a situation in which one wins the war, but ends up a loser because the cost of the war was too devastating, even to the victor. So that was a look at the family tree of Alexander the Great, as well as some of the Dyadici. As mentioned, this is all part of a brand new poster called Ancient History Family Trees, which covers from about 1600 BCE to 100 CE. If you want a copy of the chart, it just launched on Kickstarter today, and you can find more details about that in the description. Thanks for watching.